In almost all games that focus around the concept of dealing damage, there are numerous moves, abilities, and weapons made available to the player that offer variety and balance. But there's almost always one damage-dealing action that surpasses them all, and this was perhaps typified best in earlier games through the introduction of things like the BFG and Doom. Role-playing games have, of course, explored this concept too, and even though earlier Final Fantasy games were quite modest, as the franchise built out, more and more super moves started to be introduced as a way of defeating enemies quicker while making players feel awesome while doing so. Some of this has, of course, become codified as limit breaks, and we've covered a few of those in our previous video about the most powerful attacks in Final Fantasy history. But today, we're going to focus on a specific subset of damage dealing, which relates to spellcasting. So, with our usual caveat that we'll only be talking about one spell per game, here are some of the most powerful spells in the history of Final Fantasy. And we're going to kick things off with one of the most controversial implementations of magic across the entire franchise, as we take a look at Final Fantasy XV. But before we do, we are currently running a survey that encompasses the Final Fantasy franchise as a whole. All you need to do is rate every game out of 5, also specifying if you've played the game or not. And if you're on mobile, you may need to scroll to the side to see all the options. If you have the time, there's also the space available to give 5 words that you feel encapsulate the essence of each mainline entry. We look forward to sharing the results with you in the coming months. But for now, let's continue on with the video. For years, Square Enix have been wanting to push Final Fantasy towards being more action-orientated. Initially, they were careful about how this manifested within the main numbered games, but when Versus 13 was announced alongside Final Fantasy XIII, they proudly declared that it would be an action RPG not too dissimilar to Kingdom Hearts in terms of how it played. Over time, this notion did change as the game shifted into a form of development hell and Business Division 2 took over the project. Fresh from their work on Final Fantasy Type 0, they attempted to put their own stamp on Versus 13, and it was rebranded to Final Fantasy XV. This meant there were quite a few nuances that came to the fore, and one of those nuances related to the revamped magic system. Dubbed Elemency, unlike many previous systems where spells had to be learnt, here spells had to be crafted, and they were more akin to grenades due to how they were used and their finite number of uses. Due to the nature of the system, those who invested time and effort found that there was a surprising level of depth as, based on the materials used and their frequency, players were able to craft all different types of spells that had a range of applications and potency, from typical elemental damage ranging to even EXP boosting. The most powerful spells, however, were classified as limit break magic and had the potential to deal astronomical amounts of damage that broke the standard damage limit of 9,999. Limit break magic could exceed this by 10 times this cap, and it meant that any player who crafted the limit break spell Flare at a maximum potency of 999 was able to deal almost 100,000 points of damage. Now, in many respects, Final Fantasy XII was quite different from the previous mainline numbered games too, as Matsuno and Ito combined to push boundaries. But post-launch, instead of producing a standard international version that introduced new content, Ito oversaw the development of Final Fantasy XII International Zodiac Job System, which made wholesale changes to how the game was played. Many years later, this was then remastered as Final Fantasy XII The Zodiac Age, and this decision allowed players outside of Japan to experience a fresh new take on the original game for the first time. What they then found, outside of plenty of quality of life improvements, was that the original damage cap was removed. And this then opened up a boatload of possibilities as it allowed for the true power of spells in the game to be fully realised. One such spell, called Ardor, benefited from this more than most. Serving as a high-level fire spell that cost 110 LP to obtain from the license board, Ardor had the potential to be game-changing due to its damage-dealing potential, as, when cast at maximum level and with the appropriate gear and job, it could deal as much as 510,720 points of damage in a single cast. Final Fantasy VII stands as one of the most important Final Fantasy games in terms of cultural impact, but it was also one of the first games in the franchise where the damage caps became quite irrelevant based on the abilities and summons that were available to the player, and how they could then be modified using the Materia system. This system allowed players to choose which active spells characters had in their loadout, as well as which passive features they wanted to have affecting those spells, and based on the sheer volume of materia available, it meant there were lots of ways to combine them together to drastically amplify their power output. There are, of course, some pretty crazy combinations here, but if we're focusing on magic in isolation and excluding summon magic, one of the most effective strategies was to combine Comet 2 with Quad Magic and also W Magic. Comet 2 was a unique spell in that it summoned 4 comets which dealt damage to enemies individually. This then allowed the total effect of Comet 2 to surpass the damage cap by 4 times. However, max level Quad Magic then allowed for the spell itself to be cast 4 more times, and W Magic allowed for multiple commands to be selected at once. If this was all combined on a party member who used the greatest possible number of Quadramagic materia at once, this meant that a maximum of 64 comets could be summoned, which theoretically could deal 64 times the damage cap. This was considerably more damage dealt than the default version of Omnislash, but Final Fantasy VII did feature combinations that were much more powerful that included limit breaks and summons. Still, Comet 2 at maximum capacity was still pretty damn strong. Final Fantasy XIII continued the evolution of the franchise, bringing in a notable enhancement to the active time battle system that was designed by Toshiro Tsuchida. Similar to Final Fantasy X-2, it saw characters able to switch roles during battles, and although every character could take on every role, certain characters such as Vanille excelled in roles that used magic, and it meant she was very effective at casting many of the spells the game had to offer, and also had access to a few exclusive ones, such as Death. In theory, this iteration of Death functioned in a similar manner to the vast majority of iterations from across the franchise, as it had a 1% chance of inflicting the instant death status effect. But for when that didn't happen, the spell also dealt a tangible amount of damage. However, due to the nature of the spell, it had a high cost and required Vanille to exchange a full ATB gauge to use, while also being locked into the latter stages of the Crystarium system. When used though, it was very likely to deal just under 100,000 damage. But if the Genji Glove was equipped and the damage limit was broken, it could max out at just under 1 million. This made it an incredibly powerful spell, but it could be made even more powerful. In the original Japanese version, there was a bug that enabled Death to deal double damage when used against an enemy that was dazed, and this meant it had the capability to deal just shy of 2 million points of damage. That then brings us onto Final Fantasy X, a game with fantastic world building, fantastic characters, and fantastic spells. Now, we did mention in the introduction that focus would not be placed on limit breaks. However, there's a bit of a loophole here. Kimahri's limit break, Ronso Rage, allowed him to cast Blue Magic, with him able to extract enemy skills via the Lancet command. On the surface, many of these moves were quite underwhelming, but some of them had the potential to deal astronomical amounts of damage. Amongst the potential enemy skills that could be learned was a spell called Nova, and compared to many of the others, it was much harder to acquire as it was associated with a pair of superbosses, Nemesis and Omega. However, should the skill be learned, then it was able to deal ridiculous amounts of damage. In the newest modern versions of the game, Nova is capped out at 99,999 damage, making it nowhere near as powerful as many of the game's multi-hit or Aeon limit breaks. But in the original Japanese version, the same restrictions were not in place. As we covered in our previous video, this meant it was possible for Auron to deal 7.5 million points of damage in a single strike. And to counteract claims that this was impossible, the developers even provided a step-by-step guide for how to deal this massive amount of damage within the Final Fantasy X Ultimania. Since, however, we're only focusing on spells, then focus has to be placed back on Kimahri and Nova, which in the original Japanese version was capable of dealing between 4 and 5 million points of damage. That then brings us onto Final Fantasy XIV, which is an intriguing entry to discuss in the climate of most powerful spells because, due to various patches, it's always changing. In the past, Afflatus Misery was by far the strongest spell in the game, capable of doing over 10 million points of damage under the right circumstances. But due to the more recent nerfs, even though the spell is still powerful, it's nowhere near capable of dealing the same level of damage anymore. Instead, we're going to focus on Final Sting, which is a spell associated with the limited Blue Mage job. Self-sacrifice moves aren't all that common across the franchise, with perhaps the most well-known being associated with the Bomb family of enemies. But in Final Fantasy XIV, enemies within the Wesp clan can use the move called Final Sting, which could then be learned by Blue Mages. Needless to say, due to the nature of the spell, its potency was quite high, as the entire purpose was to ensure that if the enemy, or indeed the blue mage, was going to die, then they may as well take their enemy with them. When Blue Mage was added as part of Shadowbringers, Final Sting had a potency of 1,500. But this was then enhanced to 2,000 and granted a status effect called Brush with Death, which prevented the use of Final Sting, self-destruct, or transfusion for a period of 10 minutes. Even 5 years ago, players had creative strategies that revolved around rituals of self-sacrifice when bosses reached certain percentages of HP remaining, as there was no real risk in doing so as the encounter would end. This table, presumably created by Quan on Reddit, denoted the extraordinary individual and collective power of even the base move with no criticals or enhancements. Since then though, a lot has happened. But a few months ago, a Final Fantasy XIV content creator called Katsu did a detailed analysis of what is theoretically the biggest single strike in Final Fantasy XIV. There's a link in the description to check out the video for yourself, but it opened up a discussion in the comments, and this led to the conclusion that, as of right now, it's possible for blue mages to deliver almost 5.3 million points of damage. That then brings us on to Final Fantasy VIII. This is an entry with a core cast of characters so beloved that they've appeared in many other Square Enix properties, and one such example of this is Selphie, who appeared in the first entry of Kingdom Hearts. Although Selphie was memorable due to her energetic personality, she became most well known for the absurd power of her spell, The End. The End could only be cast when Selphie used her limit break and landed on the slot associated with that spell. Now, due to the power of The End, the odds of it coming up were very low, but the probability could be influenced, and one of the most important factors was crisis level. In Final Fantasy VIII, crisis level was an attribute that reflected how poor of a state the character was in the context of the scenario they were now in. It therefore increased when things looked more dire, through the character having low HP, or through the number of negative status ailments they were afflicted by. But there were also other aspects, for example, how many of their allies had been KO'd. Should Selphie land on The End, then the power was incredible. Unlike other instant death spells, The End instantly defeated every enemy in the encounter, and there were no limitations. Yes, it could even be used against the game's final boss and Omega weapon. Despite not being a true damage-dealing spell, this therefore meant The End essentially did the equivalent of infinite damage to all enemies, completely trivializing any encounter where Selphie was able to cast the spell. But with that, they were 7 of the most powerful spells in the history of Final Fantasy. How many of these spells have you taken advantage of? Be sure to let us know in the comments below, and also let us know if there are any other spells you feel should have been placed on this list. If you could also take the survey, it would be much appreciated, and if you enjoyed the video, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Alright everyone, with that, this is Daryl signing out. As always, I'd like to give a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube members and supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, CloudClone28, The Livestream, Juan Jaramillo, Justin Dent and Sukun TDK, who are super special Onion Knight supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.